The first time I heard people laugh at me in a courtroom, I was standing 10 feet away from my own father. Your Honor, my father said, straightening his $1,000 tie while the whole courtroom watched me like I was dirt tracked in from the street. My son serves fried shrimp and pours iced tea for tourists on the Charleston waterfront. He has absolutely no business managing a $23 million estate. A few people chuckled. The judge leaned back in his chair and smirked at me over the rim of his glasses. A waiter managing millions, he asked. More laughter. I can still hear it if I close my eyes. Soft, polite, educated laughter. The kind people use when they think somebody beneath them accidentally wandered into an important room. Then I stood up slowly and said, I am a retired United States Marine Corps logistics officer, Your Honor. I supervised supply coordination for over 4,000 Marines during 2 overseas deployments. The room went silent so fast you could hear somebody cough in the back row. Even the judge stopped smiling. My father looked at me like he'd never seen me before in his life. Truth was, maybe he hadn't. My name is Ethan Mercer. I was 42 years old the morning my father tried to destroy me in probate court over my grandfather's inheritance. And honestly, if my grandfather Walter hadn't died 3 months earlier, none of it would have happened. Charleston County Probate Court sits in an old brick building downtown not far from the harbor. The courtroom smelled faintly of old paper furniture polish and rainwater tracked in from the sidewalks outside. That morning the sky had been gray since dawn. I remember because I'd stood outside for 10 minutes before walking in, staring at the harbor and trying to steady myself. I wasn't nervous about the money. I was nervous about my father. At 73, Richard Mercer still carried himself like a man 20 years younger. Tall, silver-haired, perfect posture, the kind of man who never loosened his tie in public. Around Charleston, people respected him. My father had built luxury condominiums along the coast back before prices exploded. By the time I was a teenager, the Mercer name meant money. Country club money. Yacht money. The kind of money that makes people forgive flaws. My older brother Daniel inherited my father's confidence. He worked in the family business right out of college, wore expensive watches, and knew how to charm bankers at dinner parties. Me, I enlisted in the Marines 2 weeks after 9/11. My father never forgave me for that. He called it throwing my future away. Back then, my grandfather Walter was the only person who shook my hand before I left for boot camp. I'd rather have a grandson with honor than one with a fancy office, he told me quietly. My father overheard him. They barely spoke for a week afterward. I sat alone at the defense table that morning in court. No wife, no children, no expensive lawyer entourage. Just me and Mr. Abernathy, my grandfather's old attorney who looked about 90 years old and smelled faintly like peppermint. Across the aisle sat my father and Daniel with 3 lawyers. 3. That should tell you everything right there. My grandfather's will had shocked everybody. Walter Mercer left me controlling interest in the family marina, several investment accounts, and most of the estate holdings. Altogether, it was worth around $23 million. Nobody expected that, especially not my father. The problem was Walter never explained himself publicly before he died. He passed quietly in hospice after a stroke, leaving behind only paperwork and confusion. And confusion turns ugly fast when money's involved. Particularly family money. The judge shuffled papers while my father's attorney explained their argument. They claimed I lacked business experience. Claimed I was financially irresponsible. Claimed my grandfather had been manipulated late in life. I listened quietly. Years in the Marines teach you something useful. A man who talks too much usually reveals himself eventually. Then my father made the mistake that changed everything. She's just a waitress, he said, accidentally glancing at notes before correcting himself. He's just a waiter. Some people laughed harder at that. I noticed the judge smiling too. Maybe because my suit wasn't expensive enough. Maybe because I looked tired. Truth was, I was tired. I worked evenings at a seafood place called Harbor Lights down near the marina. I'd been there almost 6 years. Tourists loved the shrimp and grits. Retired locals came in for coffee every morning around 7. I liked the work. Simple as that. After the Marines, simple felt good. No explosions. No casualty reports. No 19-hour logistics nightmares trying to get fuel and medical supplies moved through sandstorms overseas. Just coffee cups, fried oysters, regular people talking about fishing and grandchildren. But my father heard waiter and saw humiliation. My grandfather heard waiter and saw honest work. Big difference. When I revealed my Marine background, the courtroom changed temperature instantly. You could feel it, especially among older folks sitting in the gallery. A white-haired man near the back nodded slowly when I mentioned logistics command. Another veteran sitting beside him folded his arms and looked at my father differently after that. Respect matters to older Americans, especially military respect. The judge cleared his throat and suddenly became very formal. Well, he said carefully, that certainly provides additional context. My father looked irritated more than embarrassed, like I'd broken some unspoken agreement by defending myself publicly. That feeling followed me my whole life around him. After several more tense exchanges, Mr. Abernathy finally stood. There are additional documents from Mr. Walter Mercer that this court has not yet reviewed, he announced. That got everybody's attention. Even my father blinked. The judge postponed proceedings until the following week so the documents could be examined properly. The gavel came down, people stood, and just like that, the hearing ended. But the damage had already been done. Outside the courthouse, rain drizzled lightly over Charleston's old stone sidewalks. Reporters weren't there yet, thank God, but a few people lingered near the courthouse steps. As I walked outside, an older black man wearing a Vietnam veteran cap stopped me gently. "Marine logistics?" he asked. "Yes, sir." He nodded once. "That's hard work." I smiled faintly. "Yes, sir, it was." Then he shook my hand. Not because of the money. Because he understood service? My father exited the courthouse a few minutes later, surrounded by lawyers. For one brief second, our eyes met across the sidewalk. No yelling. No dramatic confrontation. Just confusion. Like he genuinely didn't understand who I was anymore. Honestly, I wasn't sure he ever had. That evening, I drove down to the marina alone. The docks creaked softly beneath my boots while gulls circled overhead in the fading light. Walter's old fishing boat still sat tied near the end slip, exactly where he'd left it before his stroke. I sat there until sunset, thinking about the courtroom, thinking about my father, thinking about my grandfather. And for the first time since Walter died, I started wondering whether he'd left me that inheritance for a reason bigger than money. My grandfather used to say you could learn everything important about a family at a funeral. He was wrong. You learn the truth in court. A week after that first hearing, Charleston felt colder somehow. Rain hung over the harbor most mornings, and the tourists had mostly disappeared by then. Late October always slowed the waterfront down. The air smelled like salt and wet wood, and older folks started wearing light jackets, even when the afternoons warmed up. I kept working my evening shifts at Harbor Lights during the week leading up to the next hearing. That surprised people. A few customers recognized me from court gossip spreading around town. Charleston runs on quiet gossip the way other places run on traffic. One woman in pearls stared at me while I refilled her sweet tea and finally asked, "Honey, if you inherited $23 million, why are you still working here?" I smiled politely. "Because Doris still needs somebody to cover Thursdays," I said. Doris, our 70-year-old hostess with bad knees and bright red lipstick, laughed so hard she nearly dropped a stack of menus. Older people appreciate consistency. That's something my father never understood. To him, success always had to look impressive. To my grandfather, success meant showing up. There's a difference. 3 nights before the second hearing, I stayed late helping close the restaurant. The younger cooks had already gone home, leaving only me and Luis, our dishwasher, wiping down the kitchen. "You nervous about court?" he asked. "A little." "You gonna win?" I shrugged. "Depends what winning means." Luis stared at me a second before laughing softly. "You sound old now." Maybe I did. War ages you strangely. So does disappointment. After midnight, I drove home through quiet Charleston streets, lined with old oak trees dripping Spanish moss. My apartment sat above a bait and tackle shop about 10 minutes from the marina. Nothing fancy. 1 bedroom, old hardwood floors, a coffee maker older than some marriages. My father hated it the first time he saw it. "This is how you live?" he asked years earlier, looking around like he'd walked into a prison cell. I remember answering, "I sleep fine here." That frustrated him more than if I'd complained. The night before the next hearing, I barely slept at all. Not because of the inheritance. Because I kept thinking about my grandfather. Walter Mercer wasn't sentimental. He grew up poor outside Beaufort before joining the Navy during Korea. Everything he built afterward came from stubbornness and routine. Every morning at 6, he drank black coffee on the marina dock, no matter the weather. Every Friday, he ate fried catfish at the same diner. Every Christmas, he gave employees bonuses personally instead of mailing checks. He believed dignity mattered, especially working-class dignity. That's why he liked the marina workers more than the country club crowd. And it's probably why he understood me better than my father ever did. The next morning, the courthouse was packed. Word had spread. By the time I entered the courtroom, nearly every bench seat was filled. Older couples whispered quietly. Reporters sat along the back wall now. Even a local news camera waited outside the building. Daniel looked exhausted when I saw him across the aisle. His expensive suit hung loose on him. His eyes looked bloodshot. I noticed his hands trembling slightly while he drank bottled water. At the time, I didn't understand why. My father still looked polished as ever, but something in him seemed tighter than before. Angrier. The hearing started promptly at 9. Mr. Abernathy stood slowly carrying a thin leather folder. "I would like to submit additional evidence left by Walter Mercer," he announced. My father's attorney objected immediately, but the judge allowed it. Inside the folder were years of documents. Signed marina reports, financial authorizations, private letters. And slowly, piece by piece, the image my father built of me started cracking apart. Mr. Abernathy adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Mercer," he said to me gently, "did you assist your grandfather in marina operations during the pandemic?" "Yes, sir." "How extensively?" I glanced toward the judge. "I handled payroll, restructuring, vendor negotiations, and fuel contracts for about 11 months. My father frowned deeply. The judge looked surprised. "You have business experience?" he asked. "Yes, Your Honor." "Why was this never mentioned?" I almost laughed at that. My father never asked. Silence settled over the room again. Mr. Abernathy continued presenting records, showing I'd quietly helped stabilize the marina while Daniel traveled between investment conferences and luxury developments. I never asked for credit. Honestly, I assumed nobody cared. Then came the employee testimonies. First was Hank Rollins, a 68-year-old dock supervisor with skin like leather from 50 years in the sun. Hank walked slowly with a cane after cancer treatments the year before. "Mr. Mercer kept me employed when I got sick," he told the court. "Could have replaced me easy. Didn't." My father stared straight ahead without expression. Then came Mrs. Evelyn Parker, the marina bookkeeper. Widowed, 74 years old. She testified that I voluntarily reduced my own management payments during COVID, so no older employees would lose health care coverage. I honestly forgot I'd even done that. The courtroom listened differently now. People weren't looking at me like a waiter anymore. They were looking at me like a man. There's a difference there too. During recess, I stepped outside beneath the courthouse awning while rain tapped softly against the sidewalk. That's when Daniel finally approached me alone. Up close, he looked terrible. "You could stop this," he said quietly. "Stop what?" "All of it." I studied him carefully. For the first time in my life, my older brother looked afraid. Not arrogant. Not smug. Afraid. "What's going on, Daniel?" He rubbed both hands over his face. "You don't understand how bad things are." Before I could answer, my father stepped outside behind him. "Daniel," just one word. Sharp enough to end the conversation immediately. Daniel walked away without another sentence. My father stood beside me under the awning, watching rainwater stream along the curb. Neither of us spoke for almost 30 seconds. Finally, he said, "You embarrassed me in there." I looked at him honestly. "You embarrassed yourself." His jaw tightened instantly. That old anger flashed through his eyes again. "You always think you're better than this family." I almost smiled at the absurdity. "No," I said quietly. "I just stopped trying to impress it." That one landed hard. I could see it. For a second, my father looked older than I'd ever seen him. Not weak, just tired. Then the courtroom doors opened again and everybody filed back inside. That afternoon, the final revelation arrived. Financial records showed millions missing from company accounts tied to Daniel's division of the family business. Hidden debts, risky loans, gambling losses. The courtroom became completely still while accountants explained the numbers. I turned slowly toward my father. The color had drained from his face. And in that moment, sitting beneath harsh courtroom lights with reporters scribbling notes nearby, Richard Mercer realized the successful son he trusted had been lying to him for years. My father looked smaller after the gambling records came out. Not physically. Richard Mercer still stood straight, still wore tailored suits, still carried himself like Charleston royalty. But something behind his eyes had changed that afternoon in probate court. Shock does that to people, especially older men who spent their entire lives believing they could control everything around them. The courtroom emptied slowly after the hearing adjourned. Reporters lingered near the exits, hoping for comments, but my father ignored them. Daniel disappeared so fast I barely saw him leave. I stayed behind with Mr. Abernathy gathering paperwork. The old attorney moved carefully, sliding documents into his leather briefcase one at a time. Finally, he looked up at me. "Your grandfather expected this," he said quietly. "That Daniel stole money?" "No." He paused. "That your father would refuse to see who his sons really were." That stayed with me all night. Outside Charleston's harbor, wind carried the smell of rain and diesel fuel from shrimp boats along the waterfront. The weather had finally turned cold enough for heavier jackets. I drove straight to the marina after court. Not home. Never home after bad days. The marina sat quiet except for gulls circling above the docks. Most of the tourist boats were gone for the season. Wooden planks creaked softly beneath my boots while water slapped gently against pilings below. Walter's office light still worked. I unlocked the door and stepped inside for the first time since his funeral. Dust floated through late afternoon sunlight, spilling across old photographs and fishing trophies. The office smelled faintly like cedarwood coffee and old paper. My grandfather practically lived there during the last years of his life. Against one wall sat a framed picture of him standing beside me in my marine dress blues 20 years earlier. We were both smiling awkwardly because neither of us liked photographs much. My father never displayed military pictures in his house. Said they made rooms feel heavy. I sat at Walter's desk and opened the top drawer carefully. Inside lay stacks of handwritten notes, fuel inventories, employee schedules, maintenance reminders. And beneath them all sat a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in my grandfather's rough handwriting. Ethan. Nothing else. I stared at it a long time before opening it. Inside was a single folded letter. Short. Simple. Exactly like Walter. Ethan. If you are reading this, then your father has probably already turned grief into a business negotiation. Don't hate him for it. Richard spent his whole life believing money protected people from failure. Men his age were taught that. Some never learn otherwise. But I watched you when nobody else did. I watched how employees relaxed when you walked the docks. I watched how veterans trusted you. I watched how you listened instead of talked. You think those things don't matter because nobody applauds them, but they matter more than most things people spend their lives chasing. Money reveals character eventually. Yours was never the one I worried about. Granddad. I read it 3 times. Then I sat there alone in silence while harbor water knocked softly against the docks outside. At 42 years old, I realized that one honest letter from my grandfather affected me more deeply than every compliment my father had never given me. Funny how life works. Around 7 that evening, somebody knocked gently on the office door. It was Hank. The old dock supervisor held 2 styrofoam cups of coffee. "Figured you'd still be here," he said. I nodded toward the second chair. He sat slowly, knees cracking loudly. "Your daddy looked rough today," he said. "Yeah." Hank sipped coffee quietly. "You know your granddad trusted you long before all this." "I didn't know he trusted me this much." Hank laughed softly. "Hell, son, half this marina already knew you were running things." I looked at him surprised. "What?" "Walter started stepping back years ago. Employees noticed. You solved problems faster than Daniel ever did. That bothered me more than it should have. Not because I wanted recognition. Because my father never noticed any of it." "You know what Richard's problem is?" Hank asked. I sighed. "Where do I start?" Hank chuckled. "Your daddy thinks leadership is about being the loudest man in the room." He pointed toward the marina outside. "Walter knew it's about making people feel safe enough to do good work. Older men say things simply when they've lived long enough." That conversation stayed in my head the next morning when I returned to court. The atmosphere had shifted completely now. Nobody laughed when I entered anymore. Reporters nodded respectfully. Court staff greeted me politely. Even the judge seemed careful around me now, which honestly made me uncomfortable. I didn't want admiration. I just wanted the truth. Daniel looked worse than before. sweating heavily, avoiding eye contact. His lawyer spoke rapidly with him before proceedings began, but Daniel barely seemed to hear him. My father sat rigidly beside him, pale, quiet. For the first time in my entire life, Richard Mercer looked uncertain. The hearing focused almost entirely on financial records that day. Accountants explained hidden debts tied to failed luxury developments in Florida and Georgia. Casino withdrawals surfaced, private loans, missing company funds. Every number seemed to age my father another year. Then came the hardest moment. The judge looked directly at Daniel. Did your grandfather know about these debts before his death? Daniel swallowed hard. No, sir. Did your father? Long silence. Finally, Daniel whispered no. My father closed his eyes, just briefly. But I saw it. And suddenly I understood something painful. Richard Mercer wasn't evil. He was proud. There's a difference. Pride makes people blind to the things they most need to see. During lunch recess, I found my father standing alone near a courthouse hallway window overlooking the harbor. No lawyers. No reporters. Just an old man staring at gray water. He didn't look at me when I approached. After a while, he said quietly, "How long did you know about Daniel?" I didn't. That surprised him enough to turn around. You really didn't know. Number. Silence stretched between us. Finally, he asked the question I'd secretly waited 20 years to hear. Why didn't you tell me about the marina work, the military logistics, any of it? I looked at him carefully. You never asked. The words hit him hard. Harder than yelling would have. Because both of us knew they were true. My father leaned against the wall slowly, like his legs suddenly felt tired. At 73 years old, Richard Mercer was beginning to realize he had spent decades talking at his son instead of listening to him. And some realizations arrived too late to fix cleanly. When court resumed that afternoon, Mr. Abernathy announced there was still one final piece of evidence Walter Mercer had left behind. A recorded testimony. The courtroom went completely silent. The courtroom felt different that morning. Quieter. Not peaceful exactly. More like the heavy silence that settles over a church right before a funeral begins. Everybody knew something important was coming. Even the judge seemed unusually careful as he adjusted papers on the bench. Reporters filled nearly every seat along the back wall now. A few local business owners I recognized from Charleston had shown up too, probably curious to see whether the Mercer family empire was collapsing in public. Charleston loves old money stories, especially when old money starts bleeding. I sat beside Mr. Abernathy while rain tapped softly against the courthouse windows. Across the aisle, my father looked exhausted. Not weak, just worn down in a way I'd never seen before. Daniel looked worse. His face had gone pale over the last few days, and his hands trembled constantly now. He kept loosening his tie like he couldn't breathe properly. The judge cleared his throat. Mr. Abernathy, he said you mentioned a final piece of evidence. The old attorney stood slowly. Yes, Your Honor. Before his death, Walter Mercer recorded a private statement intended specifically for this court if his will was contested. You could feel people lean forward. My father stared straight ahead without blinking. Mr. Abernathy placed a small flash drive into the courtroom monitor system. After a few seconds, the screen flickered to life. And suddenly my grandfather appeared. The recording had obviously been made during hospice care. Walter sat in a plain chair wearing a gray cardigan sweater I remembered well. He looked thinner than I'd ever seen him, but his eyes remained sharp. The entire courtroom went silent. Walter looked directly into the camera. If you're watching this, he began calmly, then Richard is probably angry. A few uncomfortable smiles appeared around the room. My father didn't react. Walter continued. I love my son, but Richard mistakes confidence for wisdom sometimes. He believes success is measured by appearances. My father lowered his eyes slowly. Then my grandfather said the words that changed everything. Ethan never cared about appearances. That's why I trusted him. I felt my chest tighten immediately. Walter spoke slowly, pausing often to catch his breath. When COVID nearly destroyed marina operations, Ethan worked 16-hour days without asking for recognition. The video shifted briefly to attach financial documents and employee records supporting every statement. He negotiated vendor contracts, protected employee pensions, and personally covered medical insurance costs for 2 workers. The courtroom stayed perfectly still. Walter looked tired now but determined. My older son and grandson understand profit. Ethan understands responsibility. Those words landed like stones. I glanced toward my father. His face looked hollow. Not angry anymore. Just wounded. Then came the hardest part. Walter leaned slightly closer toward the camera. Richard spent his life believing strength meant being impressive. But the strongest men I ever knew were the ones who carried burdens quietly. I swallowed hard. Because I knew he wasn't only talking about me. He was talking about himself too. Korea veterans rarely discussed emotions directly, but they spoke through observations. Walter had spent years watching our family carefully. Watching my father chase status. Watching Daniel chase wealth. Watching me disappear quietly into ordinary life after the Marines. And somehow out of all of us, he'd seen value where nobody else bothered looking. The video continued another several minutes. Walter explained exactly why he structured the inheritance the way he did. Not to punish Richard. Not to humiliate Daniel. But to preserve the marina and protect the workers depending on it. This marina feeds families, he said firmly. It is not a toy for ego. That sentence hit my father harder than anything else. I could see it. Because deep down, Richard knew Walter was right. The recording ended softly. Walter looked directly into the camera one final time. Ethan, he said quietly, don't let anger turn you into strangers. Then the screen went black. Nobody moved for several seconds. Even the judge seemed emotional. Finally, he cleared his throat awkwardly. Well, he said softly, that was remarkably clear. No one laughed this time. No smirks. No whispered comments about waiters managing millions. Just silence. The hearing recessed shortly afterwards so attorneys could finalize recommendations. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded near the entrance, but I slipped away through a side exit and walked toward the harbor alone. Cold wind rolled off the water, carrying the smell of salt and diesel fuel. I stood near the seawall, staring at fishing boats rocking gently against gray waves when I heard footsteps behind me. Daniel. He looked terrible now. Not polished. Not wealthy. Just scared. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he said, I messed everything up. I kept looking at the harbor. What happened? He laughed bitterly. You know how Dad always talked about winning. Yeah. I started believing losing was the worst thing a person could become. That sentence stayed with me. Daniel explained everything slowly after that. Bad investments. Pressure from my father. Riskier deals trying to impress investors. Then gambling after the losses started piling up. I kept thinking one big win would fix everything, he whispered. That's the tragedy of gambling. Not greed. Hope. False hope destroys people more quietly than almost anything else. You could press charges, Daniel said finally. Technically, he was right. The financial evidence was enough to ruin him completely. Jail time. Public disgrace. The end of everything. I thought about it honestly. Thought about all the years he mocked me. All the family dinners where my father praised Daniel while treating me like a disappointment. All the birthdays missed during deployments overseas while nobody bothered calling. I could have destroyed him legally. Instead, I asked one question. Are you willing to get help? Daniel stared at me like he genuinely didn't understand mercy. Then he started crying. Not loudly. Just quietly, exhaustedly. Like a man finally too tired to pretend anymore. That evening, settlement negotiations began privately between attorneys. I agreed not to pursue criminal charges if Daniel surrendered all operational authority permanently and entered financial rehabilitation treatment. My father was stunned by the decision. You're letting him walk away, he asked me privately later. No, I answered. I'm letting him survive. Richard looked at me for a long time after that. And for the first time in my life, I think my father saw strength without arrogance standing directly in front of him. Court officially concluded 2 days later. The judge upheld my grandfather's will entirely. The estate remained under my control. Reporters expected celebration afterward. Big speeches. Victory. But I didn't feel victorious walking out of that courthouse. Mostly I felt tired. And sad. Because money hadn't exposed the worst parts of our family. It had exposed the loneliest parts. That night I returned to the marina after dark. The docks sat quiet beneath pale harbor lights while cold wind rattled ropes against metal posts. As I walked past Walter's old fishing boat, I noticed someone sitting near the end of the pier. My father. Alone. I almost kept walking when I saw my father sitting alone at the end of the marina pier. The old wooden dock creaked softly beneath the wind, and harbor water slapped against the pilings below in slow, uneven rhythms. Charleston nights get cold near the water in November. Not northern cold, just the kind that settles into your bones quietly. My father sat hunched slightly forward, wearing a dark overcoat, staring at Walter's old fishing boat. For a moment he looked less like Richard Mercer, the developer, and more like a tired old man who didn't know where his life had gone. I stopped a few feet away. "You'll freeze sitting out here," I said. He glanced back at me. "Your grandfather used to sit here for hours." "Yeah." Neither of us moved after that. Finally, he said I didn't know where else to go. That sentence hit me harder than I expected. Because my father had always seemed like a man who knew exactly where he belonged in every room he entered. Boardrooms, country clubs, fundraisers, courtrooms, but not here. Not anymore. I walked over and leaned against the dock railing beside him. For a while, we just watched harbor lights reflecting across dark water. Then my father asked quietly, "Did he really trust you that much?" I looked toward Walter's boat. "I think he trusted people who didn't need attention." Richard nodded faintly, like the answer hurt. After several minutes, he cleared his throat. "When you enlisted," he stopped, "I thought you were throwing your life away." "I know. I couldn't understand why you'd choose hardship when you had opportunities here." I smiled sadly. The Marines weren't hardship to me. He looked over. "What were they?" I thought about that carefully before answering. Clarity. The word seemed to confuse him. So I explained. "In the Marines, people tell you exactly what matters. Responsibility matters. Dependability matters. Taking care of people matters. Nobody cares what watch you wear." My father stared at the water silently. "You think I care about shallow things?" I almost answered too quickly. But at 42, I'd learned older men deserve honesty delivered gently. I think I said carefully, "You spent your whole life trying to prove you'd never be poor again." That landed deep, because it was true. Richard Mercer grew up with Walter during years when money disappeared fast and jobs disappeared faster. Everything my father built came from fear as much as ambition. Fear of losing status, fear of instability, fear of failure. Some men never stop running from the lives they grew up in. My father rubbed both hands together slowly against the cold. "I pushed Daniel too hard," he admitted. "Yes, and I ignored you." I didn't answer that one. Didn't need to. The silence already had. After a while, he said quietly, "I was proud of you after 9/11, you know." That surprised me enough to turn toward him fully. "What?" He sighed heavily. I didn't know how to say it without sounding weak. I almost laughed at the tragedy of that. Two grown men sitting beside dark harbor water after decades of misunderstanding each other because neither one knew how to speak plainly. Older generations carried emotions differently. My father's generation especially. Men born in the 50s and 60s often treated vulnerability like structural damage. They believed love was shown through providing, correcting, and enduring. Not talking. Unfortunately, silence grows expensive over time. Eventually, my father stood slowly. His knees cracked loudly now when he moved. I noticed things like that more lately. Age arrives quietly at first, then all at once. Before leaving, Richard looked back toward Walter's fishing boat. "I think your grandfather would be disappointed in me." I shook my head gently. "No, I think he understood you." My father stared at me a long moment after that. Then he nodded once and walked slowly back toward the parking lot. No dramatic reconciliation. No hugs. Just two tired men finally beginning to understand each other after wasting years speaking different emotional languages. Life rarely gives cleaner endings than that. The following months passed quietly. The reporters disappeared once newer scandals arrived elsewhere. Charleston moved on the way cities always do. I officially assumed management of the marina and estate holdings by January. Truthfully, not much changed in my daily life. I still lived above the bait and tackle shop. Still drove my old truck. Still worked occasional evening shifts at Harbor Lights because Doris threatened violence if I quit. "You think rich people stop needing crab cakes?" she snapped one afternoon. That woman was 70 years old and terrified everyone in the restaurant, especially me. I used much of the inheritance stabilizing marina operations permanently. Employee retirement plans improved, Dock repairs got finished. Healthcare coverage expanded for older workers nearing retirement. Walter would have approved of that. I also created a scholarship fund quietly for children of marina employees and local veterans. No press conference. No giant announcement. Just paperwork. My grandfather taught me long ago that real generosity usually happens quietly. Daniel entered treatment in Atlanta for gambling addiction shortly after court ended. Recovery changed him. Not overnight, but gradually. The arrogance faded first. Then the excuses. A few months later, he called me unexpectedly one evening while I was repairing fishing nets at the marina. "I'm sorry," he said simply. No long speeches. No dramatic breakdown. Just honesty. For the first time in years, I believed him. My father started visiting the marina occasionally by spring. Never formally. He'd just show up around sunrise carrying coffee and stand awkwardly near the docks pretending to inspect boats. One morning he watched me teaching a teenage dock worker how to repair damaged netting. Afterward he said quietly, "Your grandfather taught you that exact knot." Yeah, he taught me too. That was the closest thing to nostalgia I'd ever heard from him. The final time we spoke seriously happened late one afternoon, almost a year after the trial. We sat together outside Walter's old office watching pelicans dive across the harbor. My father looked older now, softer somehow. Finally, he said, "I thought success looked different." I stared out across the water. Granddad didn't. Richard nodded slowly. And that was enough. These days when sunset settles over Charleston Harbor and the marina quiets down for the evening, I sometimes sit beside Walter's old fishing boat thinking about everything that happened. The inheritance. The courtroom. The laughter. Funny thing is, the $23 million stopped mattering long ago. What stayed with me was simpler. My grandfather saw me clearly when almost nobody else did. And sometimes that kind of recognition changes a life more than money ever could. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever felt unseen by family, misunderstood by people you loved, or judged for choosing a quieter life, then maybe you already understand what Walter was trying to leave behind. Not wealth, trust. And maybe the older we get, the more we realize that's worth far more. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story stayed in your heart tonight, I hope you'll share it with someone who may need it too.